Hi everyone, welcome to the webinar. I'm just making sure we're all set to go here. Looks good so far. I'm sure we'll have people joining as it's right at 10 o'clock. I'm sure everyone's super busy, but I wanted to get started on time. We will for sure end on time. I'm also going to turn on my webcam here. We're all socially distancing, but I am actually here. So hello. All right. So we are going to talk about COVID-19, times of uncertainty, grief, complicated grief, how that connects to trauma, and really what do we do? How do we support ourselves, support others? And as I'm sure all of us know, we could certainly talk about this longer than about 45, 50 minutes, but I hope it gives an overview of some information about this and offers some resources and support. I also like to just remind everyone about the EAP and the services we offer as part of that process of what can I do to support myself and others. The EAP is definitely here for you, and I'll give you some information about that. But while people are joining, there's a few sort of technological housekeeping things I want to briefly go over. I'm sure some of you are very familiar with this interface and GoToWebinar panel, but if you're not, just a few reminders, because we do have quite a few people signed up today, which is wonderful, but I want to make sure everyone knows kind of the overview of GoToWebinar. So as you can see here on your screen, you'll have kind of this side panel on your screen with a few different things. The main thing that I wanted to give you some information about right away is on your version of this, if you click on the little button next to handouts, you'll see two attachments, and they'll both be PDFs. One is the slide deck from today. So if you wanted to download today's slide deck, you absolutely can do that, and that's in that handout section. There is also a very important document called Webinar Tech Support. And if you are having any technical issues, it's almost always related to audio issues, but there is all sorts of information. So if there are any issues whatsoever in terms of the tech help, tech issues, please download and look at that PDF first. It is almost always enough to get people where they need to be in terms of getting help. With that, I also noticed, so there is a feature on your end with this little hand with the green arrow for a hand raise feature. Unfortunately, the problem with using that in this large of a group in this setting is that I only see that a hand went up, but I don't know who or why they're asking a question, so it's hard for me to really interact in that way. If you do have a question, please type that into the question box right here. When you type in a question, I'm the only one who sees that. So if you're typing in a question about the content or anything that you need, I will see who sent that question in and I'll see what that is, but it doesn't go to everyone. And that's just a reminder up here. We default to anonymity, and so I don't want anyone to not want to ask a question in fear that people would all see what they were asking. So that is anonymous. When it's a question about content, I will just sort of summarize what is written there, but I won't say who asked it. So I would say the big pieces here are go to the handout section if you're having technical issues and download that PDF with the tech help. If you have questions about the content or anything, and we'll have time at the end for Q&A, type that into the questions box. We will later on have a few live polls. Those are also completely anonymous and certainly totally optional. But the more people who do the poll, the more interesting the results. And since they are completely anonymous, I love for people to participate in those whenever possible, because it's always really interesting to kind of get a gauge where people are at on that. So with that, I think we went over most of the tech support side of things. Yes, someone typed in a question, will this be recorded for later viewing? Absolutely. That's a great question. So this is going to actually go up on our YouTube page probably sometime this week. And so that will be free for whoever would like to watch it after today. So if anyone missed it today or didn't get a chance to come to the live version, that's a great question. Yes, it will be on Cascade Center's YouTube page. And so that hopefully answers that, but very good question. Again, if you want to save the slide deck, that's under the handouts as well. All right, so let's get started. What I wanted to kind of talk about first is just kind of a very brief overview. So I've been with Cascade since 2014, but my background is in trauma psychology. I'm also a certified alcohol and drug counselor. I've been a clinician for over 10 years. I've worked with individuals, groups, couples, families. I primarily do trainings now, but definitely spent a lot of time working with people and talking about this topic, particularly trauma, how grief relates to it. But as we all know, we are all at the same time in uncertain times, and uncertain times is an understatement, I realize, but is being used as kind of an umbrella term for everything that's going on. And what I wanted to kind of briefly go over is what comes up for us during uncertain times in general. And then I'm going to talk more specifically about complicated grief, more about trauma symptomology. And then the rest of the time I really want to spend on how does this show up for us? How do we take care of ourselves? What do we do? And that's going to look different for each person, certainly, but there's some overarching, strategies to help ourselves, both on a physical level, emotional level, social, all of those things. So probably most of us are familiar with the stages of grief, have heard of them, either know some of them. And one thing I like to do, I did want to make sure they were listed here. This is one version of someone's perspective on what the stages of grief look like. And there are many other perspectives in psychology, counseling, in terms of how grief response shows up, not even specific to complicated grief, but any kind of grief. So I like to start off with giving, the list of the stages of grief, but with an understanding that that may not be what your grief, if you're experiencing it, looks like. You may experience some of those things and not all of them. You may experience them in different order. You might be going in those stages in order, but then go back to one. So probably one of the major themes of today's webinar is there's nothing wrong with you. There's not one way that everybody deals with grief or uncertain times or trauma. And so I think I try to really make sure to focus on normalizing and validating our experience. Two very counselor-y terms, but very important. And we will sometimes worry, I'm not coping the same way my colleague is, or I'm not coping the same way my friend or loved one is. That's normal. And so I think sometimes we will almost over label our experience sometimes without just thinking, what do I need right now? And that's what we'll talk about, some self-care. But I do still think it's good to understand what are some symptoms that can come up, and also as a normalization and validation experience. So those are the common stages of grief. Again, you may feel some, none, or all of those. But those are stages pre-pandemic. They still absolutely are valid and happening for people during and experiencing all of this, as we all are. But there are other things going on. So the National Institute of Health has done a lot of research since COVID started, since spring of last year, around primary and secondary losses. And I think sometimes when we hear the word grief or we think about grief, we will, and again, not to generalize, but many of us will automatically think just about the death of a loved one, about death. We can experience grief and loss for many reasons. And especially during the pandemic, this has been very notable because people have experienced loss of a job. They have experienced loss of a certain type of lifestyle or plans they'd made. There's a ton of different things we can experience loss around. And we even do trainings just on coping in a changing environment when we taught that topic long before the pandemic. And we talk about grief even in that. Even if it's a change, back in the day, if someone changed jobs or moved, we can experience grief just from coping with change, having that uncertainty. And so I also like to remind people about how there are a lot of different ways we can experience grief. And there's research now about that, and even more now through everything that's happened in the last year. How do we define loss, define grief? And what I think is also helpful is that this normalizes it, because sometimes we can say, I'm not feeling myself. I'm having these symptoms or these experiences, but it can't be grief because there wasn't a death. And you can still be experiencing grief symptoms, even if there wasn't a death involved. And we'll talk a little bit more in a bit about essential workers and some of that secondary losses too. And the other thing that comes up a lot with coping with grief and coping with uncertainty is that we want a sense of control. And this second and this fourth bullet point, I think, are very similar in a lot of ways, because we like to understand how things work. We like to have routine. We like to feel like we have a sense of control over the things that we're doing in our life, our experiences. And when all of that, or a lot of that, goes by the wayside because of an unexpected global pandemic, in all areas of our life tend to be a sense of not having control, not knowing what's going to happen next. And that's distressing enough if it's one area of our life, but when it's all, it's extremely distressing. So that sense of locus of control starts to go away, which, and I'll talk about this more when we talk about trauma and a trauma response, because that is a big piece of trauma. And then there's also that isolation, limbo state, meaning making, and this is where it ties into grief. So it's that kind of Venn diagram. If we think about trauma, grief, our response to that is that what our brains and bodies like to do is kind of go through almost a bell curve. We're at a certain state, something happens that's distressing, traumatic, a loss. We go through stages of reacting to that, having emotional, social reactions, going through that process of that experience, and integrating that into our narrative in some way. And a lot of that comes from making meaning, from finding a sense of closure, whatever that looks like for us. And when we are in a global pandemic, what we're finding is a lot of times people saying, I don't know how to have a sense of closure because we're all sort of in this limbo state. When will this end? When can I see people in person again? Because so much of finding closure, finding support is social interaction and social support. Rituals around how we cope with grief and loss in our own life. And when those are also interrupted, that's where we get even more distress. So there's a level, multiple levels of things we're experiencing. So at the very least, if you're feeling like you are having a very difficult time, if you are not sure what to do, I promise you're not alone. And I wanted to just kind of spend some time to normalize that a little bit. But when we're thinking about complicated grief, and again, just like this slide says, this presentation is not meant to diagnose anyone. Obviously, if you are feeling like you're having certain symptoms, if you're feeling like you're, struggling with doing your daily tasks, that's where you can call EAP, find counseling, find extra services. This is really just informational at this point. But there's different types of grief, and I'm not going to read every single one on here, but as you can see, there's grief kind of as a whole. And then there's that acute grief. Again, that's more that early period after it occurs. And when we're looking at that integrated and complicated, those are sort of two sides to an experience. Integrated grief, kind of like I mentioned earlier, where we can integrate that experience into our narrative, that comes from, if we go back to those stages of grief, that idea of acceptance. And acceptance, of course, does not mean that we are okay with something. It means that we accept that it's the reality. And there's a lot of understanding how that's integrated into our narrative and being present with that experience and taking care of ourselves. It's really, that integration level and that acceptance level shows up more as it's kind of the opposite of denial and avoidance. And sometimes with complicated grief, what happens, it can be because of the type of the loss. It can also be because of how we're responding to loss. So it isn't necessarily only going to happen because of the type of loss or because of our history of either mental health, our history of trauma, our history of our previous losses in our life. It can be a whole mix of things. But this is where it's, for some reason, we're struggling to integrate that into our reality in a way that we can move through it, that we can cope with it effectively. And so as it says here, there can be maladaptive thoughts, there can be avoidance, denial, and it sort of is looking at those early stages of grief that we go through before acceptance. If we're looking at that model, is kind of staying in those and not knowing how to move through them. And that's where there is tons of different types of treatment, counseling, services. So if it's something where you feel like you aren't finding a way to get through your grief reaction or experience, there are resources for you. And I'll provide all of our contact information at the end of this. But again, this isn't meant to diagnose. It's really just thinking about, for my experience, and this goes back to earlier, no one grieves exactly the same. And it's not meant to pathologize. It's more just, what do I need? What are my symptoms? What do I need right now? How do I step away from comparing myself to others and focus on what would be best and most helpful for me in this time? So to speak a little bit on trauma, because I do want to spend a good deal of time talking about what do I do? How do I take care of myself? And so the first part of this, again, is primarily focused on what's happening, how do we sort of talk about this, and then what do we do? So with trauma and traumatic events, a lot of this is, and this isn't my sentence, but what I've heard described a lot and I think is helpful is trauma is a normal response to an abnormal event. And that's where, we're not going to go into a full science lecture here, but I do think it's helpful to understand what's happening in our brain and in our bodies when we are faced with something that's life-threatening, distressing in some way. And a person can experience vicarious trauma, so we can experience that from hearing someone else's story of a traumatic event, witnessing it happening to someone else. So all of that can cause us to go into this reptilian brain. So we have these different layers on our brain, and this dark purple, that prefrontal, that neocortex, as you can see here, that's higher reasoning. Our logic brain is online. We can act based on choice. Here are my options, and I'm going to think logically about what might be best. When we are in survival mode, that fight, flight, freeze mode, that goes offline. It's like, all we need to do right now is survive. So our body's going to take over. It's just going to decide what's best for us right now. And the thing that's interesting about, or notable about being in a global pandemic, is that similar to what I mentioned earlier, that bell curve, there's a stimulus, our response to it, and then we come back down to where we started. A global pandemic is a stimulus, and then we stay up here. It's chronic anxiety, chronic stress. And so our bodies are experiencing, we are in a constant state of distress right now. And then thinking, why am I not feeling myself? Why do I feel like the coping skills I used to use are not as effective? And why is this so difficult right now? And part of this is because it's difficult to think logically, consider our needs, make choices that are, best for what we need, when some of that, part of our brain is offline and we're just in survival mode. And that's why I think it's helpful when I talk about some coping skills, the physical coping skills too, because we sometimes will try to think ourselves out of distress, but that part of our brain isn't even online to help us do that. So we need to physiologically help regulate our emotions, and then we can start thinking about more logically, what do I need? What do I need to take care of myself? And then again, we may see some symptoms. So PTSD, which I'm sure all of us have heard many times, but ASD, that is acute stress disorder. So that's more short-term symptomology. So PTSD really in terms of a diagnosis is if some of these symptoms, as you see here, are showing up longer than 3 months after the event. But we're going to have, many of us, not everyone, but many of us are going to experience some of these symptoms right away. And so that's where that differentiation comes in. Again, not meant to diagnose anyone, but just kind of showing examples of common symptomologies, what may come up with feeling and experiencing a traumatic event. So we're in multiple things happening right now for everyone. Okay. So the other thing too, when we're talking about our part of our brain being offline, chronic distress, chronic fear of the future, traumatic events that we're either witnessing, because I'm sure many of you are essential workers, is trying to, the second bullet point, and I've heard this a lot recently with someone, people will say, very understandably, I'm expected to maintain my same level of productivity at work under these distressing circumstances, under feeling, chronic grief. I'm feeling like I'm in traumatic environments, and I still have to maintain a level of productivity. And that then just compounds the stress on our body and on our psyche. So if you're in that state where it's like, how do I even have time to take care of myself? I'm just trying to maintain my same level of productivity. So just normalizing that. And there's a really great question that came up about how we can best support our loved ones and peers who are experiencing grief. I'm glad that you asked that. And I definitely want to touch on that in a little bit. So the other thing too is, for many people, their job pre-pandemic has changed. Maybe they're, the same company, but it's like we either had to make layoffs and so now we need you to take on this task, or the entire structure of our organization is different because of social distancing. And so we're trying to learn new things with part of our brain sometimes offline, stay just as productive. So again, if anyone's thinking this is very difficult, to say the least, these are some of these reasons that are coming up for us. The other piece here that I want to kind of touch on now, but then we'll give some examples as we go through and continue to talk about this, is balancing boundaries with our emotional and social support at work and at home. What do I mean by that? So this is in no way meaning that we don't process our feelings or spend time taking care of ourselves. Quite the contrary, it's how we do that most effectively. And what I think sometimes happens is we may, whether it's with coworkers, whether we are living with other people, and maybe we're an essential worker, maybe the person or people we're living with are, or they are and we're not, is figuring out when and how to talk about our experience. And what I see happen a lot, and this is totally understandable, is people will be just in kind of survival mode, get the job done, trying to stay productive at work in an essential worker job, for example. But either way, I think everyone's under a lot of stress right now with their jobs if they're working. And they'll get home and just vent about everything to the person they're living with or their partner. And sometimes we need that space to vent, but there's a way to do that to create some boundaries for ourselves and for the other person, and think about, how do I allow myself some space and time in my waking day, and I'll talk about sleep here in a moment, that's restorative, and there's space to process our experience, process the emotions related to it, talk about what happened. And there are times to figure out how to have restorative self-care, both socially, emotionally. And I think sometimes we will find ourselves just kind of venting to each other. Maybe, again, both people have essential worker jobs, and then that ends up being kind of the only thing that happens in that time together. And there's that balance of how long and when do I process some of that. It does not mean that it's not ever appropriate to do that with loved ones. That's a lot of what, we need, that support with someone who understands us, who maybe is doing similar work, and that's absolutely appropriate, and there's times to process that. But I've had sometimes people say, we set a timer and this is how long we vent about work or we talk about it, and then we do something else to sort of allow ourselves some space to think about something positive, something restorative, some level of self-care. And there's different types of self-care. So it's figuring that balance. And that can either be boundaries with ourselves of what do I need with that, boundaries with another person, having that conversation of, what would work best for us so we can feel like we support each other, but we also have restorative self-care time. And let's see, there's another question came in. Yeah, there's a great question here asking about how can we approach our supervisors about our grief experience and managing our workload. Wonderful question. One thing I like to do if I'm ever going to leadership, supervisor about something that I need or a request, and the one you're mentioning is more than valid, obviously, is going in with, as much as possible, and I know it's not always possible, a solution in mind. So what I always try to think about in terms of communication is, if I were to go in and sit down with the supervisor or schedule a meeting and say, here is one thing, or here are two things that would help me feel more supported at work. Here is one thing that would help me feel less burnt out at work. Here is one thing that would help me more effectively manage my workload. And if you can ever have some strategies and solutions in mind going into that meeting, and I know sometimes we don't know, I can say, right now, I'm at my limit with my workload in terms of the time to do it. Can we sit down and strategize some measurable things that we can put in place? And you may not have a solution in mind, but I like to, as much as possible ahead of time, think of anything that would be a possible solution and take that in. Because when we have something measurable, solution focused, that will sometimes allow that meeting to be more productive with more notable, measurable next steps. So that would be one suggestion I have for that question. But as we go through here, if you have any follow-ups, let me know. I'm just keeping an eye on time as well. So this is not an exhaustive list of signs and symptoms, and this can be signs and symptoms of feeling burnt out, feeling a grief response, feeling overwhelmed, having vicarious trauma or a trauma response. And again, a lot of us are like, I'm having all of the above, you know. And so some signs and symptoms we may see that show up at work, outside of work. A lot of what I see, and there's also compassion fatigue. So compassion fatigue really comes up if we are helping professionals and we are providing a lot of emotional and social support to other people, and we kind of don't have any more left to give at a certain point because we don't have that time for ourselves, that reciprocity somewhere on our own life. And so that a lot of times what I see when people are burnt out and compassion fatigued is that sense of apathy. And I've worked in community mental health for many years. I've worked with people still in community mental health and many other helping professions in mental health, medical, etc. And because helping profession is a much more broad term than just mental health or medical, a lot of people in their jobs are helping other people in some way. So if we're kind of at our limit, that apathy kicks in. We can find ourselves being more cynical. It's just hard to care at all anymore. And then when we are overwhelmed, burnt out, that's where some of that irritability can come in. And this is where it's interesting because social isolation can come up pre-pandemic, and now we're already socially isolated. And a lot of times, you know, what we talk about is connect to other people, find that sense of community, find that sense of connection with peers, with loved ones. And right now it's like, so how am I supposed to do that? And when we are in a period of a pandemic, it's figuring out it may not look exactly how I want it to right now, but there are still ways to connect to others, and I'll give some examples later as well, but whether it's Zoom, whether it's on the phone, because it's slowly moving into nicer weather, there may be ways to safely social distance outside with people. You know, are there ways that I can integrate in that social support that I need? And sometimes it requires more steps because right now there are less organic in-person things happening. We have to schedule things, and that sometimes is even more work, but taking time to do that to establish some social connections. And then again, trying to figure out productivity. If we're having a tougher time coping with stress, like I'd mentioned earlier, surprise, surprise, that's probably because of the situation that we're in. And so if you're wondering why it's harder to cope with things, you're not alone. We're all doing the best we can. Concentration is a big one. And then if we find ourselves falling into unhealthy coping strategies, and that's where we really just kind of pay attention to what am I doing right now to take care of myself? Is it restorative? Is it reactive? Is it healthy for me? All right, some things that can come up for essential workers. And I want to do some polls here in a moment once we get into the self-care piece. Because, you know, one of the things that's interesting too when I talk about compassion fatigue, essential workers, and I'm sure we have a mix of people in today's webinar, but a lot of times when someone goes into a helping profession, we already sometimes have a hard time taking care of ourselves as well. It's like we want to help other people. We want to do the best we can to be the best helper possible. And sometimes that shows up as forgoing our own needs. But the other thing I think that's coming up a lot for essential workers right now is this concept of secondhand grief. And this is where it's paying a lot of attention to validating our experience. Because what I'll hear, this is what I hear a lot, is I shouldn't feel this way because it could be worse. That's a thing that we say a lot. Or I shouldn't feel this way because this person has it worse than me, so I feel guilty having this reaction or experiencing this emotion about it. I don't know that it qualifies as grief because it didn't exactly happen to me. I just know the person that it happened to. So these are all ways that our brain starts to go into invalidating our experience, and that is not going to help us in any way. And sometimes I like to reframe the very common thing that we do is, I shouldn't feel this way because someone has it worse than me. At least I've never seen anyone do this. If you think about it in the opposite way, if someone were to say, you shouldn't be that happy because someone out there is happier than you right now, it doesn't mean that that is any less valid of an experience. So trying to step away from either I should or shouldn't feel, that sentence alone is not helpful, both to tell ourselves or to tell someone else, and to normalize your experience. So this is where it's just I'm feeling this emotion, and that is valid. End of sentence. So part of that is the secondhand grief experience. So when we are working essential workers, frontline workers, and we are seeing a lot of people struggling, experiencing loss, experiencing trauma, all of these things, we can experience that as well. It's similar to vicarious trauma. It's really that vicarious grief. And sometimes it's hard to find closure, to figure out how to integrate that, because it's someone else's and we want to value their experience, but we're also experiencing it. It sometimes feels hard to talk about because it didn't happen directly to us. And so how do we, process this? A lot of this, and this goes to this first bullet point, kind of like I'd mentioned, acknowledge your experience and validate it instead of I should or shouldn't feel this way. So that's the number one thing. Identify your symptoms. How am I feeling mentally about this? How am I feeling physically? How am I feeling emotionally about it? And mentally could be that you're, thinking a lot about it, having memories about it, flashbacks of that experience or that memory. And then the fostering healthy relationships, this sort of like I'd mentioned earlier with that boundary setting, that way that we communicate with others. When I am seeking support and fostering healthy relationships, that may show up in seeking out a specific social support, counseling support group, and I can provide you some resources on that at the end. And then there's also healthy relationships. How do I have time as well, whether it's loved ones, friends, colleagues outside of work, that we can foster healthy relationships where we are supporting each other in a way that's restorative, that we can spend time together, that is, there's those mental boundaries of when we choose to think about this. And again, it's not about avoidance, it's not about validating that experience, it's really about figuring out what's best for us in that time. And if our brain is going into just those automatic thoughts, just like this picture, it's actually not helpful. It's just like we're having these ruminating thoughts, and sometimes our brain needs a break. Focusing on our own needs as well, and then knowing when to seek help, professional help. So let's do a poll question. I know I've been talking for a while. I also saw a question come in. I'm not ignoring you, but I do want to have some time at the end for Q&A as well. So if you've typed in a question, I haven't answered it yet, it doesn't mean I haven't seen it. We will get to it. Okay, let's try this poll first and see how people are feeling about this. So you should see that on your screen. And again, these polls are completely anonymous, and I will show the results. People are starting to put in their votes. So this is asking, or the statement is saying, I feel guilty practicing self-care or burdening others with my stress. And burdening, again, is in quotes. I did that on purpose. And we're about half of you have voted, so I'll give it a few more moments just to let people take a second and think about how they're feeling about this. All right, so we have 70% of you voted. I'm going to give it 10 more seconds. All right, so let me close that out and I'll show you what we have in terms of the results. So as you can see here, not too surprising, a lot of you are in that strongly agree or somewhat agree. So this is exactly what we're talking about, pushing through that guilt, and a lot of that is reframing that. But I also wanted to note too, the reason that we talk about do these polls, not only is it for allowing yourself your own self-awareness, it's also to, again, normalize and validate. And if you're thinking, I thought I was going to be the only person who clicked strongly agree, nope, about a third of the people are right there with you. Or wherever you fall on that, you're not the only one. So this, I think, again, shows up so often is we feel guilty taking care of ourselves. And it's the most cliche metaphor, but it is very accurate. You know, the oxygen mask on the plane, like we cannot help someone else if we're not also helping ourselves. So the more, if you find yourself thinking, I feel guilty taking time for my own self-care, I feel guilty seeking whatever self-care I need because other people need my help, what helps is to really focus on the best way that I can be the best support to others is if I establish as much time and what I need for myself too. Because what happens is when we get burnt out, it goes back to that earlier list of symptoms. We become more apathetic, we become cynical, we can become more irritable. That does not make a very helpful person when we're in that state. So this goes back to that mental coping. If you catch yourself feeling guilty, then what I try to think is, why am I feeling guilty right now? And how do I reframe that experience? So I'm actually going to jump to this next slide, and then we'll talk about the one that I just passed over, because this is where some of the individualized self-care strategies can come in. And journaling is similar. Some people, again, with this list of examples, these are just a few, there may be some things on here that I go over that you're like, that is not going to work for me. I'm not a journaler. That's totally fine. And part of self-care is also taking enough time to figure out what works for you. That in and of itself is self-care, to make it extra meta. So did I even allow myself space to figure out what works for me and what doesn't? So you may go through this process and practice some of these things and think, this really helped, this didn't. But one thing that can help with journaling, because I think sometimes when people hear journaling, they hear this concept of like, I just wrote down everything that happened today. For some people, that's super helpful, but journaling can take a lot of different forms. And so it may just mean I'm going to write down the 3 or however many emotions I'm feeling right this second. I'm not doing full sentences. I'm just writing down, what am I feeling right now? Or anytime I feel guilty about self-care, I'm going to write that down, and then I'm going to write down an alternate reality. Actually, what would be best for me right now is to practice self-care so I can be better support to someone else. So there's different ways that we can use writing. It's very grounding. Sometimes even, doing it physically on paper can be helpful. The other thing that, again, this goes back to physiological self-care, is the 5-4-3-2-1 exercise. If you've been to my webinars before, you know this one, but I always talk about it because it's a grounding technique. And trauma, particularly, causes us to be not grounded, because our experience of trauma is essentially experience of fear and anxiety and a lack of safety or control, which for many of us goes into short or long-term dissociation. And so being grounded and safe in our current experience is part of trauma coping. And so a grounding technique that is very quick and simple to do is the 5-4-3-2-1 exercise. And so what that is, and it kind of is, laid out here a little bit, but what that looks like is that wherever you were, you would just do this in your own head so no one knows you're doing it. Be 5 things you can see. So if you were doing that right now, it might be your computer screen, your cell phone, a glass of water. 4 things you can physically feel. This one's really important, and this is the one I usually have people say, I didn't even notice. It's like, are both of your feet on the ground? How does the chair feel? Are you standing up? Are you holding a glass of water? How does that feel? And if you actually tap into that experience, you'll notice how in touch you are with that, or how out of touch you are with what you are physically feeling in your environment. 3 things you can hear. And if you stop for a moment and really think about it, you can hear even little things. So I'll have everyone try that for a moment. Just try to think of the 3 first things you can hear. And you may be working from home, you may be at an office, and maybe you heard a computer or some sound in the background, but really getting grounded enough to pay attention to that. 2 things you can smell or like the smell of, and then 1 thing that you're grateful for. And I like to do that. Again, you can do it as often as you need. It's very quick. No one knows you're doing it. And what I find a lot when we are, especially with essential workers, especially with high stress jobs, it feels like I don't even have a second. Sometimes we think self-care is going to be this very involved, long process, an hour-long meditation or some type of activity that we can't do during the workday. So I have a lot of times people saying, I'm literally in survival mode during my workday, and that's very often more than 8 hours, for a lot of people. And then by the time I get home, it's just, I don't have time to go do a whole hour-long meditation. If you do, that's great. Some people love meditation, some don't. But small things you can do as needed are really important. So we're not in this sort of pendulating between extreme survival mode and then trying to practice self-care later. There's square breathing. That is where all 4 parts of your breath take the same amount of time. So the pause before you breathe in, the breath in, pause before you breathe out, and the breath out. And you can have those take whatever amount of time would be natural for your natural rhythm. Tapping, there's a website called the Tapping Solution. This really helps with physiologically down-regulating our bodies and brains when we are in a trauma response. One, and I think you can see me okay, is where you just cross your wrists like this, and then right below your collarbones here, you would just tap back and forth. So it's like the butterfly tapping, and that actually can downregulate our system a little bit. So that's something you can do quickly and easily and anytime you need to. Spatial distress tolerance, taking up more space. I've had people say, you know, if I'm anxious on a phone call, what I'll tell them is stand up if you can. Taking up more space reduces anxiety. And then we'll continue to talk about social supports as well. Communicating our needs, that was related to one of the questions that someone asked earlier, communicating our needs at work. That can also mean communicating our needs outside of work. I really want to be a support to you, and I want to hear about how your day went. Can we have that be an hour after I've gotten home? I really need that hour after I've gotten off work to decompress, to have time for myself. How can we make this a setup so both of us feel like we can support each other and have space for that, both for our individual self-care and social self-care? And that's another thing, is how am I communicating my needs, respecting someone else's needs, and finding a space to have healthy boundaries and support each other, but in a way that works for everyone. Maintaining a routine as much as possible is very grounding, because when we are experiencing trauma, if we're experiencing grief, distress, anything that can be logistically grounding is very helpful. This also comes up with hobbies. I've had a lot of people find that hobbies with a clear beginning, middle, and end is very effective when we're seeking closure, when we're seeking meaning, when we're seeking a sense of groundedness to the present, and everything around us is not allowing us to do that. If there's something as simple as cooking, crafting, even just a simple chore, that gives us a sense of there was a beginning, middle, and end, and that concluded. And although it may be a very simple thing, it's the process behind that rather than just the content of it. And that I think can be helpful too. And then this is, you know, if we're really thinking about, I need to process my emotions, I need to feel my feelings, as a counselor would say, feelings. This I find helpful if someone's like, okay, what does feelings mean? And a lot of times we tell ourselves there's good emotions and there's bad emotions. The challenge with that is that if we label emotions good or bad, we will avoid the ones that are bad. I'm not supposed to feel that. There's nothing good about feeling that. It's problematic in some way, so I'm just going to push it down, and I'll only feel the feelings that are good. And many of you, or some of you, may be familiar with Brene Brown. She has a couple of TED Talks, lots of books. She has a website, but she talks a lot about how you can't selectively numb emotions. And we will do that even without realizing it sometimes, is I'm going to numb my grief, I'm going to numb my distress, and still try to feel joy, happiness. That's just not how it works. So there's a concept of name it to tame it. And really, emotion management is not, here's the emotions I'm going to feel and here's the ones I'm not going to feel. It's re-establishing a relationship with all of our emotions in a way that we can feel them and feel safe to feel them. They may be uncomfortable. That is completely understandable. Probably most of us are uncomfortable feeling grief, shame, distress, whatever the experience may be. But avoiding it is not going to help us. It's actually just going to show up when we least wanted it to. So this is, I think, sometimes helpful to think about, all right, if I'm going to sit down and kind of try to process or feel my feelings a little bit, what can I do to look at it on paper and kind of go through those steps? The last thing I'll say about this slide is that I always want people to try these 5 steps with an emotion that you like feeling first, because if we try to go down this road with an emotion that's really difficult, we'll get to step 1.5 and be like, I hate this. So if you can tap into your emotional state and start with something that's easier to feel, just even experiencing that, like, how do I feel that in my body? What thoughts come up when I'm having that emotion? When you practice that a little bit with an easier emotion to feel, then you can do that more with more difficult ones. The last thing I'm going to do here, we have another poll question. Okay, this is going somewhere. I'm really interested where people are at on this. So take a moment to answer this one. Oh yeah, the votes are coming in quick. And we have about over 60% of you voted. I'll give it about 10 more seconds here. Oh yeah, a lot of people are voting on this one. Okay, so I'm going to close that out. We had 80% of you have voted. Definitely have some interesting results, so let's take a look at this. Okay, so we have a real mix here, but as you can see, regardless of which one you chose, you're not alone. Sleep is one of the biggest indicators of where is most commonly, almost always, where I hear people struggling with sleep. And not just during the pandemic, but it certainly hasn't improved. And difficult emotions, and the reason I ask this now is because that emotional avoidance, what happens, like, I'm just going to push down that emotion I don't like. Guess when it usually shows up? When we're trying to fall asleep. The other thing is there's an interesting concept that's come up in the last few months. It's certainly not something I came up with, and some of you may have heard about it. It's been mentioned in the news. Is a concept called revenge sleep procrastination. And what that means, it's like a very fancy term, is that for many of us, that time right before, like when we're laying in bed and haven't fallen asleep yet, feels like the only time that's like our time. And so we will sometimes either consciously or unconsciously stay awake as long as possible for me time, essentially, like whether it's scrolling through social media, whether, you're on your phone or watching a show. And that's turned into this, like, this is the only time I have, so I'm either not going to waste it. The revenge piece comes in where it feels like, for some people, it may feel I am, doing so much for other people throughout the day and I don't have time for myself. So like, this is the time I have for myself. And again, sometimes this is consciously happening or unconsciously happening. And I didn't come up with that concept. I certainly think, revenge is a strong word. It can just be sleep procrastination. That's also a common experience. So 2 things. Number 1, this is where communicating your needs and setting boundaries so it doesn't feel like the only time you have for yourself is when you should be sleeping. And then figuring out how to be on a regular sleep schedule, because all of us know, if we want to have any hope of emotional coping, concentration, distress tolerance skills, lowered anxiety, if we aren't sleeping or if our sleep schedule is just all over the board, it's very hard to do that. I understand for essential workers, it is crazy. There's not a lot of control over that. Job hours change. I totally get that. So there's things that are in our control and not in our control. But that's where it's thinking about, when I am trying to establish a sleep routine, how am I, if that's my only time before bed for me time, am I extending that out, which is then just further causing me more anxiety, more distress, because I'm on no sleep then. So it turns into this kind of feedback loop. So it's important to consider how we are setting boundaries around our sleep schedule and organizing that. This, I think, is just a reminder. We talked about this a little bit earlier, but those social connections are really hard. And I completely, we've heard so many times, I understand, all of us are human. We want, when we're grieving or struggling, we want to give someone a hug. We want to sit with someone. We want to physically be with other people for that support and connection. It is so difficult to be literally disconnected. And I realize, almost everyone, there's a Zoom fatigue aspect. It doesn't feel as organic on the phone. It's hard if there's a lot of people. It's not ideal for a lot of situations. And so it's thinking, how can I make this stay connected to people as best as possible during a time where I may not be, able to, whether it's for social distancing in terms of where people are at the vaccine, it could be because people geographically don't live near each other. There's so many factors. And so this is really thinking about, what can we do? And this may be something where you're going to a supervisor, can we do something that we, have a meeting that's, honoring the losses, or structure something to name this experience that we're having and validate it. And it is extremely difficult, but even small steps to find ways to be connected to others and take those steps and figure out what our needs are is really important. And then this is, I think this is, the last one here. I just wanted to talk about this briefly. This is full circle back to the beginning. When I talked about that sense of, when we get caught in, I shouldn't feel that way, other people have it worse than me, I don't have it feels selfish to practice self-care. It's so important to think about what literally just, I'm doing the best I can. What do I need right now? End of sentence. And it can help sometimes to think about what we need in different categories. So I'm doing the best I can. What do I need right now? And what do I need emotionally, socially, physically, and logistically? And then, are there areas I can ask for help? Some of us have an easier time asking for help than others. What are some measurable things I can do to either schedule time into my day to practice self-care? What can I do if I need some emotional support? Maybe that's setting up counseling. Maybe I need to, set up a Zoom call with some loved ones. What do I need to practice that's self-compassion? Because self-care is the actual activity itself. Self-care could be writing in a journal, going to see a counselor. Self-compassion is the process behind those activities. And so if we are trying to practice self-care through, I don't think I deserve this, we're not going to follow through with that if we schedule it, or even if we get to the point of scheduling it. So practicing self-care through the lens of self-compassion is where we really need to get to. And we as humans, especially if we're, frontline workers, but all humans, this capacity to care about others, to empathize with others, we have that capacity. It's just also allowing us to do that towards ourselves too. So I sometimes try to think about, when I'm about to consider my needs or practice self-care, is it through the lens of self-compassion? And how would I know if it was? And a lot of times we'll know that when we are interrupting that feeling of guilt. So this is, these kind of categories around what self-compassion looks like, because again, sometimes these, more counselor terms like, how is that defined? And I like the way that Kristen Neff defines these. So that's really what we're thinking about when we're talking about self-compassion. All right, so I wanted to take a look at, because a lot of these bullet points on this last slide we already went over, but I'm just looking at some questions. And if anyone else has some questions, we have about 5 more minutes. Let's see here. Yeah, so this there's someone asking about, they're living with someone experiencing grief related to a death that happened a few years ago. And, I'm sure for this person and for many of us, the current circumstance may be bringing up old memories or old experiences, compounding, our experiences. So that's very common. And, how do we best support them? I think this is where that sense of I statements come in. And, I'm here for you. I want to support you as best as possible. What would be most helpful for you right now? Because I think a lot of times when we want to support other people in their grief, and I've done a lot of immediate responder crisis or grief response groups, and for many years, a lot of those were in person, and people say, I don't know what's the right thing to say. What do I say to someone? And that's commonly a stressor, and very understandably. And sometimes it's not necessarily the exact right thing to say. There isn't one exact right thing to say. A lot of times it's asking questions. The other thing too is if we say, do you need anything? Usually we'll hear the person will be like, no, because they don't want to burden someone. So a lot of times I try to think about, okay, if I'm living with this person, they've got a lot going on, maybe I can go run an errand for them. I know they always do, and I can take that off their plate, or I have time tomorrow for this. Would this be helpful for you? If I helped with this, I can do this. So having some strategy around that support and that I statement, I'm here for you, I support you, and what would be most helpful for you right now? How could I best support you as, and can I do this for you? So sometimes those types of questions can be helpful. So there's some questions, there's some really wonderful questions coming in. Some of this is, I think, there was an overview today about grief and trauma, and some questions coming in I think are incredibly valid and important. I don't have time to effectively answer them in full capacity in 4 minutes, but if there are certain things that you're wanting to discuss more in more detail, our counseling resources are absolutely available. There's another question. I think we have time for one more kind of quick one. So this person's talking from a manager's perspective. It's hard to say no when people have certain needs, whether it's an employee, partner. It's hard for me to take care of myself, they're saying, because there's just so many needs around me. And that's where it is, you know, we're sometimes just like, it's one thing after the next. And I try to focus on being as present as possible, because our mind can be like, oh gosh, now what am I going to do tomorrow? To slow down, and if there's ever something where you can have assistance, maybe an employee has something they need, can someone else that you work with address that need just as effectively? And that also comes from our ability to ask for help if we need it. To explain what next steps are going to be like. If it's a partner, family member, that's where it may be setting some boundaries around what you can and can't do. And here's what I can do. I don't have time for this, but I can do this. So there's ways to reframe that it doesn't just feel like, I'm sorry, I can't help you. And that's another thing, that if it's something that's ongoing or you want to work with a counselor one-on-one on some strategies with more kind of specifics, we can support you with that. And I wanted to put our information up here. Even though it's a pandemic, we are offering counseling services. So telehealth, phone or video, all with licensed counselors. Our phone number there is 24/7 and it's unlimited. If you ever need to talk to a counselor just immediately right away, 24/7, you can call our phone number. You can go on our website. Also, you know, this webinar is going to go on our YouTube page. We have tons of other webinars already on our YouTube page if you want that as a resource. And you can text in. For some people, they may say, you know, if I need to set up services, I'm living at home, we're all social distancing and I want it to be confidential, calling is difficult. You can text instead. That's completely confidential if that's easier for you. We want to be as accessible as possible. And I know that we had so much to cover today and there's a lot of great questions. Hopefully I got to as many as I could. And I hope this was a helpful starting point to consider, you know, how to take care of yourself, to know that you are not alone. I promise you're not. It's a really difficult time for all of us, and to focus on, you know, what you need, how to access those support, the support that you need. And we are absolutely here for you for all of that. So I will end because I want to respect everyone's time and schedules. You may have things that start right at 11, but if you do need anything else, don't hesitate to contact us, and have a wonderful rest of your week, and take care.